The Crusades and the effect on the West. The Crusades were a series of military and religious conflicts that took place in Europe and the Middle East during the Middle Ages, as Christian kingdoms in the West sought to seize control of the Holy Land and Palestine from Islamic powers. These campaigns began at the end of the 11th century and lasted nearly 200 years, marked by bloody battles and shifting alliances, leaving a profound impact on both East and West. In 1095, Pope Urban II issued his famous call at the Council of Clermont, urging European princes and knights to take up arms and liberate Jerusalem from the infidels. This appeal ignited immense religious fervor across Europe, drawing thousands from all social classes, from impoverished peasants to wealthy nobles, to join what later became known as the First Crusade. The participants' motives were diverse. While some saw it as an opportunity for penance, others sought personal glory or wealth. Crusader armies traversed Eastern Europe, reaching Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, before advancing into Anatolia and then the Levant. In 1099, the Crusaders successfully captured Jerusalem after a brutal siege and established a series of Crusader states, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Principality of Antioch. However, these states were unstable, facing fierce resistance from local Islamic powers such as the Zengids and the Ayyubids under Saladin, who recaptured Jerusalem in 1187 after the Battle of Hattin. These events triggered subsequent campaigns, such as the Third Crusade led by Richard the Lionheart, Frederick Barbarossa, and Philip Augustus, which failed to permanently reclaim Jerusalem. Over time, the Crusades shifted from religious expeditions to politically and economically motivated wars, exemplified by the Fourth Crusade, which deviated from its course and sacked Christian Constantinople in 1204, weakening the Byzantine Empire and deepening the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity. Although the Crusaders ultimately failed to maintain their presence in the Middle East, their impact on Europe was profound and lasting. The Crusades opened new channels of communication between East and West, facilitating the transfer of scientific and philosophical knowledge from the Islamic world to Europe. Italian cities like Venice and Genoa flourished commercially due to the influx of Eastern goods through newly established trade networks. Politically, the Crusades weakened the feudal system in Europe, as the need to fund campaigns strengthened monarchs at the expense of local nobles. The papacy also gained influence as a central religious and political authority, though its credibility suffered due to repeated Crusader failures. Culturally, the encounters between East and West transformed European lifestyles. Crusaders introduced new products such as sugar, silk, and spices to European markets. Literature and art were enriched by Eastern tales, inspiring works like the legends of King Arthur and his knights. However, this period also saw negative developments, including rising hostility toward Jews and Muslims in Europe, with many Jewish communities massacred during the Crusades. The failure of the Crusades to achieve their religious goals also sowed doubts about the Church's authority. Ultimately, the Crusades marked a pivotal turning point in the history of Europe and the Middle East, initiating lasting contact between the two worlds despite the accompanying bloodshed. These wars reshaped Europe's political and economic landscape, paving the way for the Renaissance and subsequent age of exploration. The influence of the Crusades on the power dynamics between kings and nobles. The Crusades, a series of religious and military campaigns initiated by Latin Christendom between the 11th and 13th centuries, profoundly reshaped the political and social structures of medieval Europe. Among their most significant impacts was the transformation of power dynamics between kings and nobles. Prior to the Crusades, feudal Europe was characterized by a decentralized system where local lords wielded considerable autonomy, often rivaling or even surpassing the authority of monarchs. However, the Crusades altered this balance in several key ways, strengthening royal authority while simultaneously weakening the traditional power bases of the nobility. One of the most immediate effects of the Crusades was the substantial depletion of noble wealth and manpower. Many lords and knights, eager to secure spiritual rewards or expand their fortunes, sold or mortgaged their lands to finance their expeditions to the Holy Land. This exodus of nobles left their estates vulnerable, often falling under the control of kings or more powerful regional rulers who could consolidate their holdings. Moreover, the high mortality rate among crusading nobles meant that many feudal lineages were extinguished, allowing monarchs to reclaim vacant fiefs or redistribute them to loyal supporters, thereby reducing the independence of the aristocracy. The Crusades also necessitated the centralization of military and financial resources, a process that inherently favored monarchs over fragmented noble authority. Raising and sustaining large armies for distant campaigns required unprecedented levels of organization and taxation, tasks that feudal lords were ill-equipped to manage independently. Kings, leveraging the religious fervor surrounding the Crusades, imposed new taxes, such as the Saladin tithe, and asserted greater control over military levies. This shift not only enhanced royal revenues but also established precedents for centralized governance that outlasted the Crusades themselves. Furthermore, the prestige associated with leading a crusade bolstered the moral and political authority of kings. Monarchs like Richard the Lionheart of England and Louis IX of France gained immense stature as defenders of Christendom, elevating their status above that of their nobles. This symbolic capital allowed kings to demand greater loyalty and obedience, framing dissent as not just treasonous but also sacrilegious. The Church, a key ally in the Crusades, often reinforced royal authority by excommunicating rebellious nobles or endorsing monarchs as God's chosen leaders. However, the Crusades also introduced complexities. Some nobles returned from the East with newfound wealth, knowledge, and military experience, temporarily reinvigorating their influence. The exposure to advanced Byzantine and Islamic administrations inspired administrative innovations that both kings and nobles sought to exploit. Yet, over time, the financial burdens of repeated crusading expeditions eroded noble autonomy further, as many were forced to seek royal patronage or enter into debt, becoming dependent on monarchs for survival. In the long term, the Crusades accelerated the decline of feudalism and the rise of stronger, more centralized monarchies. The redistribution of lands, the growth of royal taxation, and the ideological reinforcement of kingship all contributed to a reconfiguration of power that favored crowns over crowns. By the late Middle Ages, the nobility's role had shifted from semi-independent warlords to courtiers and administrators within royal bureaucracies, a transformation that owed much to the upheavals of the Crusades. Thus, while the Crusades were framed as holy wars for Jerusalem, their most enduring legacy may have been the silent revolution they wrought in the corridors of European power, tilting the balance irrevocably toward kings and away from the feudal nobility. When the Crusades set out from Europe toward the Islamic East at the end of the 11th century, this movement was not merely a military or religious conflict, it was also a significant civilizational encounter between two distinct worlds, the Christian European world, thirsty for knowledge, and the flourishing Islamic world with its advanced sciences and technologies at the time. Through this prolonged interaction, which lasted for centuries, Europeans became acquainted with numerous technologies and sciences that were either unknown to them or not sufficiently developed. They brought this knowledge back to Europe, contributing to profound transformations in various fields such as medicine, engineering, agriculture, and industry. Medicine held a prominent place among the sciences Europeans adopted from the Islamic world during the Crusades. Muslim physicians were far more advanced in diagnosing and treating diseases compared to their European counterparts, who often relied on primitive practices. Among the most notable techniques Europeans learned from Muslims were advanced surgical methods, such as the use of sutures made from animal intestines, as well as sterilization techniques that reduced the spread of infections. They also adopted many compound medicines and herbal extracts that were previously unknown in Europe. Additionally, the Crusaders brought back Arabic medical texts, such as the works of Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Al-Razi, which were later translated into Latin and became foundational references in emerging European universities. In the field of engineering and architecture, Europeans were heavily influenced by Islamic technology, particularly in the construction of castles and fortifications. The Crusaders observed that Islamic fortifications were far more durable and intelligently designed compared to European castles of that era. Among the key technologies Europeans adopted were the use of round towers instead of square ones, as they were more resistant to catapult attacks. They also learned techniques for digging deep moats around castles to strengthen defenses, as well as methods for constructing double walls that made breaching fortresses extremely difficult. These techniques were later applied in European castles, leading to significant advancements in military architecture during the late Middle Ages. In agriculture, The Crusaders brought back many new crops cultivated in the Islamic East upon their return to Europe, such as cotton, sugarcane, citrus fruits, and melons. They also adopted advanced irrigation techniques used in Islamic lands, such as water wheels, norias, and aqueducts, which helped improve agricultural productivity in Europe. Furthermore, they introduced sophisticated soil fertilization and crop rotation methods, leading to increased yields and a reduction in the famines that periodically struck the European continent. In industry, Europeans became familiar with many technologies widespread in the Islamic world during the Crusades, such as papermaking, which was far more advanced than the parchment Europeans had traditionally used. The transfer of this technology to Europe facilitated the wider spread of books and knowledge. The Crusaders also learned from Muslims the production of soap using vegetable oils and alkalis, replacing the primitive methods that relied on animal fats, leading to significant improvements in personal hygiene and public health in Europe. Additionally, Europeans adopted techniques for crafting decorated glass, luxurious carpets, and silk textiles, all of which were advanced industries in the Islamic world. In military affairs, the benefits Europeans gained from the Crusades were not limited to improved castle construction but also included new weapons technologies. The Crusaders noted the superiority of Islamic weapons, such as the famed Damascus steel swords, renowned for their hardness and sharpness, as well as the composite bow, which was more powerful and accurate than traditional European bows. They also became acquainted with gunpowder, which Muslims occasionally used as an incendiary weapon. Although Europeans did not widely adopt gunpowder until later periods, this knowledge paved the way for a revolution in military tactics in subsequent ages. In navigation, Europeans learned new shipbuilding techniques and methods of celestial navigation using stars and astronomical instruments like the astrolabe from Muslims, contributing to the later development of European maritime voyages. They also brought back more accurate maritime maps used in the Mediterranean, which helped open new trade routes. The influence of Islamic technologies on Europeans' daily lives cannot be overlooked, such as the use of windmills, which were common in the Middle East, as well as food preservation techniques like drying and pickling, which helped store food for longer periods. The Crusaders also introduced many games and sports popular in the Islamic world to Europe, such as chess, which later became an elite pastime on the continent. Thus, despite their military and religious nature, the Crusades served as a bridge of knowledge between East and West. When Europeans returned, they brought with them technologies and sciences that later contributed to Europe's Renaissance, transforming various aspects of life, from medicine to agriculture, and from industry to architecture, paving the way for the European Renaissance, which changed the course of history. How did the Crusades impact the feudal system in Western Europe? The Crusades, a series of religious and military campaigns launched by Western European Christians in the late 11th century, profoundly influenced the feudal system that structured medieval society. These expeditions, initially aimed at reclaiming the Holy Land from Muslim rule, inadvertently transformed Europe's political, economic, and social frameworks. Feudalism, defined by a strict hierarchy of lords, vassals, and serfs tied together through landholding and military service, experienced significant changes due to the Crusades. The departure of numerous nobles and knights, the strengthening of centralized monarchies, the expansion of trade and cities, and the shifting balance between ecclesiastical and secular powers all played a role in the gradual erosion of traditional feudalism. One of the most immediate consequences of the Crusades was the reduction in the number of feudal lords. Many nobles and knights took the cross, mortgaging their estates or leaving them under the care of stewards to join the campaigns. Some perished in battle, while others remained in the Crusader states, never returning to Europe. Their prolonged absence weakened feudal ties, as vassals sometimes seized the opportunity to gain more independence or even claim the lands of absent lords. Kings, particularly in regions like France and England, exploited this situation to strengthen their own authority, extending royal jurisdiction over local feudal courts and demanding direct loyalty from minor nobles. The financial strain of the Crusades also disrupted the feudal economy. Participating nobles required substantial funds to finance their journeys, leading many to sell or lease their lands to townspeople, merchants, or the church. This transfer of property from feudal lords to the rising merchant class and religious institutions hastened the decline of manorialism. Furthermore, the increased demand for supplies, arms, and transportation invigorated trade, fostering a money-based economy that gradually replaced feudalism's land and service structure. Italian maritime republics like Venice and Genoa profited immensely by funding and transporting crusaders, further undermining the agrarian feudal system. The Crusades also promoted social mobility, a concept at odds with feudalism's rigid hierarchy. Younger sons of nobles, who would have otherwise been left landless due to primogeniture, found new opportunities for wealth and prestige in the East. Some became rulers in Crusader states, while others returned to Europe with considerable fortunes. At the same time, the involvement of commoners, whether as volunteers or paid soldiers, challenged the traditional view that military service was reserved for the knightly class. The Church's promise of spiritual rewards for crusaders also elevated participant status, regardless of their feudal rank. Additionally, the Crusades intensified the power struggle between the papacy and secular rulers. By mobilizing armies under its banner, the Church demonstrated its ability to command warriors independently of feudal obligations. This shift diluted the traditional lord-vassal relationship, as many knights saw themselves as soldiers of Christ rather than mere vassals of earthly lords. The papacy's imposition of taxes to support the Crusades also undermined the financial autonomy of feudal nobility. Over time, the Crusades contributed to the centralization of royal power. Monarchs who had initially endorsed the Crusades to redirect their nobles' martial energies later used the momentum to reinforce their administrative control. Governing in the absence of Crusader barons allowed kings to expand their bureaucracies, reducing feudal fragmentation. By the time the later Crusades ended in failure, feudalism in Western Europe was already in decline, making way for the emergence of nation-states. While the Crusades were not the sole factor in feudalism's decline, they accelerated existing trends. The reallocation of land, the growth of commerce, changes in military organization, and the restructuring of political power all stemmed partly from the disruptions caused by the Crusades. By destabilizing the feudal order, these holy wars helped initiate a new phase in European history, one characterized by centralized kingdoms, urban economies, and a more dynamic social hierarchy. The long-term effects of the Crusades on trade and commerce. The Crusades, a series of religious and military campaigns launched by Western European Christians between the 11th and 13th centuries, had profound and lasting effects on trade and commerce that extended well beyond their immediate historical timeframe. Although the primary goal of these expeditions was to secure the Holy Land from Muslim rule, their unintended consequences on economic systems, commercial networks, and cultural exchanges reshaped the medieval world and laid the foundation for the modern global economy. The interactions between East and West during and after the Crusades facilitated the transfer of goods, knowledge, and technologies, leading to significant changes in trade routes, market structures, and financial systems. One of the most significant long-term effects of the Crusades was the revival of Mediterranean trade. Before the Crusades, the Mediterranean had been a contested space dominated by Byzantine and Islamic powers. However, the increased movement of European crusaders, merchants, and settlers into the Levant reintegrated the region into broader European economic networks. Italian maritime republics such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa played a crucial role in transporting troops and supplies, and in return, they secured profitable trade agreements and established commercial colonies in key ports like Acre, Tyre, and Constantinople. These outposts became vital centers for the exchange of luxury goods such as spices, silks, and precious metals, which were in high demand in European markets. The desire for Eastern goods grew significantly as returning crusaders and travelers brought back exotic products and stories of distant lands. This increased demand stimulated the expansion of both overland and maritime trade routes, connecting Europe more closely with the Middle East, Central Asia, and even the Indian subcontinent. The Silk Road, which had previously been controlled by Muslim and Mongol intermediaries, saw greater European involvement as merchants sought direct access to valuable commodities. The Crusades thus acted as a catalyst for reconnecting Europe with the broader Eurasian trading system, a link that had weakened after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Another major impact was the development of more advanced financial and commercial institutions. The need to fund large-scale military campaigns led to innovations in banking and credit. Italian bankers, particularly from Florence and Siena, devised new methods for transferring money over long distances, reducing the risks of carrying large sums. Letters of credit, bills of exchange, and insurance contracts became more common, laying the groundwork for modern banking. Additionally, the establishment of permanent European trading posts in the Levant encouraged the growth of a merchant class that operated across cultural and political boundaries, fostering early forms of international trade. The Crusades also contributed to the decline of feudalism and the rise of a money-based economy in Europe. The feudal system, which relied on land ownership and agricultural production, began to weaken as nobles sold or mortgaged their estates to finance their participation in the Crusades. Meanwhile, the influx of wealth from trade enriched urban centers, empowering merchants and artisans who became key players in a new economic order. Cities grew in importance as commercial hubs, and the rise of guilds and trade associations reflected the increasing complexity of economic life. This shift from an agrarian economy to one that valued commerce and urban development was a crucial step toward the late medieval and early modern periods. Cultural exchanges during the Crusades further influenced trade by introducing Europeans to advanced technologies and agricultural practices from the Islamic world. Crops such as sugar, citrus fruits, and cotton were brought back to Europe, transforming agriculture and creating new industries. Knowledge of papermaking, irrigation techniques, and navigational instruments like the astrolabe enhanced European manufacturing and exploration capabilities. These innovations not only improved local economies but also prepared Europe for future maritime expansion, including the Age of Discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries. However, the Crusades also disrupted existing trade networks. The conflicts destabilized regions that had once been commercial hubs, such as Syria and Palestine, leading to shifts in economic power. The sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade in 1204 severely damaged Byzantine trade, allowing Italian merchants to dominate the eastern Mediterranean. Meanwhile, the rise of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century temporarily restored stability to overland routes, but the eventual collapse of Mongol rule and the spread of the Black Death in the 14th century caused further disruptions. In the long term, the Crusades helped integrate Europe into a more interconnected global economy, setting the stage for the capitalist transformations of the Renaissance and beyond. The commercial practices, financial tools, and cross-cultural exchanges that emerged during this period were crucial in shaping early modern Europe's economic systems. While the Crusades were driven by religious and military motives, their most enduring legacy may be their role in the evolution of global trade and commerce. How did the Crusades affect the relationship between Christians and Muslims? The Crusades, a series of religious and military campaigns spanning nearly 2 centuries, left an indelible mark on the relationship between Christians and Muslims. These conflicts, driven by a complex interplay of religious fervor, political ambition, and economic interests, reshaped interactions between the two faiths in ways that reverberated far beyond the medieval period. The initial call for the Crusades by Pope Urban II in 1095 was framed as a holy endeavor to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule, but the consequences of these wars extended well beyond territorial conquests, influencing cultural perceptions, trade, and interfaith dynamics for centuries to come. Before the Crusades, interactions between Christians and Muslims were not uniformly hostile. In regions such as Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, and the Byzantine Empire, there were periods of coexistence, intellectual exchange, and even collaboration in science, philosophy, and commerce. However, the Crusades introduced a new era of sustained military confrontation, deepening religious animosities and solidifying a narrative of mutual enmity. The capture of Jerusalem by Crusader forces in 1099, marked by widespread violence against both Muslims and Jews, became a defining moment that fueled Muslim resentment and shaped their perception of Western Christians as aggressors. Over time, Muslim leaders such as Saladin emerged as unifying figures in the resistance against the Crusaders. Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem in 1187 was not only a military triumph but also a symbolic restoration of Muslim dignity, contrasting sharply with the brutality of the Crusader conquest. His chivalrous treatment of defeated Christians was later romanticized in both Islamic and Western chronicles, yet the broader legacy of the Crusades remained one of distrust. The repeated clashes between Crusader states and Muslim dynasties, such as the Abbasids, Fatimids, and later the Mamluks, reinforced a cycle of retaliation and reinforced the idea of an irreconcilable divide between the two faiths. Beyond the battlefield, the Crusades also had lasting cultural and economic repercussions. The prolonged contact between East and West, however violent, facilitated the transfer of knowledge, technology, and goods. Muslim scholars had preserved and advanced Greek philosophy, medicine, and mathematics, which later reached Europe through Crusader encounters and trade routes. At the same time, the demonization of Muslims in European literature and religious discourse perpetuated stereotypes that endured long after the Crusades ended. In the Muslim world, the memory of the Crusades became a powerful symbol of Western intrusion, later invoked during periods of colonial expansion in the 19th and 20th centuries. Modern extremist groups have weaponized this history, framing contemporary conflicts as continuations of medieval wars. Conversely, in the West, the Crusades were alternately glorified as heroic adventures or critiqued as unjust wars of aggression, depending on the historical context. The Crusades did not create the divide between Christians and Muslims, but they deepened it in ways that influenced diplomacy, theology, and cultural identity for generations. While there were moments of cooperation and mutual respect, the dominant narrative that emerged was one of conflict, a legacy that continues to shape interfaith relations today. Understanding this complex history is essential for addressing the lingering prejudices and fostering meaningful dialogue between the two communities. The Crusades had a profound impact on how Christian societies perceived Islam, shaping European views of Muslims for centuries. Before the Crusades, Christian knowledge of Islam was limited and often distorted, relying on inaccurate accounts and myths passed down through generations. However, with the launch of the First Crusade in the late 11th century, direct contact between the Christian and Islamic worlds began, leading to significant shifts in perceptions and attitudes. Initially, Crusader propaganda depicted Muslims as enemies of Christianity and a threat to Christendom. The Church used inflammatory rhetoric to motivate warriors and the faithful to join these campaigns. Muslims were portrayed as barbaric pagans, despite Islam being a monotheistic faith like Christianity. This stereotype helped fuel hostility and justify violence against the Islamic world. Yet, over time, as interactions between the two sides deepened, some Christians, particularly merchants and scholars, began to recognize the more complex aspects of Islamic civilization. During the periods of Crusader presence in the Levant, Europeans encountered the scientific, medical, and philosophical advancements of the Muslim world, translating many texts and transferring knowledge back to Europe. This cultural exchange, though limited amid military conflict, helped correct some misconceptions. However, religious and political animosity remained dominant in public discourse, as the Church continued to vilify Islam to unite Christians against a common enemy. After the fall of the last Crusader states in the 13th century, European perceptions of Islam evolved into a mix of fear and fascination. On one hand, the fear of Ottoman expansion in later centuries reinforced the negative image of Muslims as invaders. On the other hand, some European thinkers during the Renaissance began showing greater interest in Islamic culture, particularly in philosophy and science. Yet, the overall image of Islam in the Christian imagination remained tainted by prejudice and ignorance. Ultimately, the Crusades were not just military conflicts but also cultural and religious clashes that shaped the West's view of Islam for centuries. While some positive interactions occurred, the primary legacy of these wars was the perpetuation of a negative and distorted image of Islam, which continued to influence relations between the Islamic and Christian worlds into the modern era. Cooperation and mutual respect between Christians and Muslims during the Crusades, which spanned centuries, the prevailing image was one of bloody conflict and deep-seated enmity between the Christian and Muslim worlds. Yet history conceals within its folds lesser-known stories of cooperation, understanding, and mutual respect between the two sides, despite the overarching atmosphere of war. The Crusades were not merely a series of brutal battles but also a period of cultural, economic, and even military exchange between peoples caught in the midst of this great clash. At times, relations between Crusaders and Muslims transcended hostility into genuine cooperation, particularly in regions where the two groups coexisted for extended periods. In the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, for example, trade relations flourished between Muslim merchants and Crusaders, with coastal cities like Acre becoming hubs of commercial exchange between East and West. Some Crusader rulers even entered into treaties with neighboring Muslim princes, not only for military reasons but also to ensure the stability of their domains. Among the most striking examples of this cooperation were the unexpected military alliances that emerged intermittently. In certain battles, Crusader nobles allied with Muslim leaders against others of their own faith when faced with a common enemy. For instance, Crusaders sometimes formed alliances with Muslim rulers in Damascus against the Zengids or Ayyubids when they saw it as politically or militarily advantageous. On a social level, many Eastern Christians, who had lived under Muslim rule before the arrival of the Crusaders, coexisted relatively peacefully with their Muslim neighbors even during the Crusades. In some areas, the Crusaders allowed Muslims to remain on their lands, and some Muslims even served Crusader nobles as soldiers or advisors. Conversely, some Christians lived under Islamic rule and enjoyed the protection of sultans, particularly in Egypt and Syria. Cultural and scholarly exchange did not come to a complete halt because of the wars. In the courts of certain Crusader rulers, such as Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, dialogues took place between Muslim and Christian scholars. Frederick II himself, criticized for his tolerance toward Muslims, invited Muslim scholars and artists to his court in Sicily, contributing to the transmission of Arabic knowledge to Europe. The role of translation during this period cannot be overlooked, as many scientific and philosophical texts from the Islamic world were translated into Latin in centers such as Toledo and Sicily, later fueling the European Renaissance. Even in times of war, some believed that knowledge had no religion and that wisdom could serve as a bridge between civilizations. In conclusion, although the Crusades were, at their core, a violent religious and political conflict, they also witnessed moments of understanding and coexistence, reminders that history is not black and white but rather shades of gray, reflecting the complexity of human relationships. How did the Crusades shape the political landscape of the Middle East? During the Middle Ages, the Middle East underwent radical transformations in power structures and political boundaries as a result of the Crusades, which spanned 2 centuries. These military campaigns began in the late 11th century when Pope Urban II called upon European Christians to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. This appeal served as the spark that ignited a series of military and religious conflicts, which not only affected relations between East and West but also permanently altered the balance of power in the region. When the Crusaders arrived in the East, they established several kingdoms and principalities, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Principality of Antioch, which became centers of European authority in the heart of Islamic territories. These new political entities introduced governance and administrative systems inspired by European feudal traditions, creating a blend of cultural and political influences between the 2 civilizations. However, the existence of these Crusader states provoked fierce resistance from local Islamic powers, which in turn reshaped internal alliances and conflicts among Muslims. The rise of leaders such as Nur al-Din Zengi and later Saladin played a crucial role in unifying the Islamic front against the Crusaders. After the Battle of Hattin in 1187, Saladin succeeded in recapturing Jerusalem, restoring Muslim confidence and demonstrating the importance of political and military unity in confronting invaders. These events not only undermined the Crusader kingdoms but also contributed to the emergence of new dynasties such as the Ayyubids and later the Mamluks, who became the dominant power in the region for centuries to come. Additionally, the Crusades enhanced commercial and cultural exchanges between East and West, influencing the political economy of the region. With the collapse of the last Crusader strongholds in the 13th century, the wars left a legacy of hostility and mistrust, but they also contributed to the formation of a more cohesive political and religious identity in the Middle East. In the end, it can be said that the Crusades were not merely military conflicts but a key factor in redrawing the political map of the Middle East. They contributed to the rise and fall of empires, shifted strategic alliances, and shaped national and religious identities whose effects remain palpable to this day. The role of religious leaders in the Crusades. Religious leaders played a central role in the Crusades, serving as the driving force behind the military campaigns that lasted for centuries between the Christian world and the Islamic East. Their role was not limited to the spiritual aspect alone but extended to the political, military, and social spheres, making them influential figures in the course of events, in the Christian world. Pope Urban II was one of the most prominent religious leaders who ignited the spark of the Crusades. In 1095, he delivered his famous speech at the Council of Clermont, calling upon princes and knights to take up arms to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. The Pope used a speech filled with religious fervor, promising forgiveness and salvation to all who participated in this campaign. His call was not merely a religious appeal but also an attempt to unite Europe under the authority of the Catholic Church at a time when it was suffering from internal divisions. After the launch of the First Crusade, the role of priests and monks who accompanied the armies became prominent. They encouraged the warriors and boosted their morale with promises of paradise if they were martyred. They also played a role in enforcing religious discipline within the camps, organizing prayers, and conducting religious rituals before battles. On the Islamic side, prominent religious leaders emerged, such as Saladin, who was not only a military commander but also a religious scholar and statesman. Saladin succeeded in uniting Muslims under the banner of jihad to confront the Crusaders, using religious rhetoric to motivate soldiers and mobilize sentiments against the invaders. He also took care to present himself as a defender of Islam, which earned him great legitimacy in the Islamic world. The roles of religious leaders were not limited to the military aspect. They also participated in diplomatic negotiations. Often, bishops and monks acted as mediators in establishing truces or prisoner exchanges between the two sides. They also had a significant influence in shaping public opinion, promoting the idea that the Crusades were a holy war, whether from the Christian or Islamic perspective. Moreover, religious leaders played a role in governing the regions occupied during the Crusades. In the Crusader states, bishops and patriarchs participated in governance and oversaw the construction of churches and religious institutions. Conversely, in Islamic regions, scholars and jurists played a role in preserving Islamic identity and countering Christian missionary efforts. Over time, the roles of religious leaders evolved as the conflict progressed. At times, they urged continued fighting even in the darkest circumstances, while at other times, they called for peace when war became futile. With the end of the Crusades, their military role declined, but their spiritual and cultural influence remained long-lasting in both the Christian and Islamic worlds. The impact of the Crusades on the development of Christianity. The Crusades, a series of religious and military campaigns waged between the 11th and 13th centuries, left an indelible mark on the development of Christianity. These holy wars, sanctioned by the Latin Church, sought to reclaim Jerusalem and other sacred sites from Muslim control, but their consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. The Crusades reshaped Christian theology, ecclesiastical authority, cultural exchange, and the relationship between the church and secular powers, ultimately influencing the trajectory of Christianity in profound and lasting ways. One of the most significant impacts of the Crusades was the reinforcement of papal authority. The Pope, as the spiritual leader of Western Christendom, played a central role in rallying European nobility and commoners alike to take up the cross. The call to arms by Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont in 1095 exemplified the Church's ability to mobilize vast resources and people under the banner of faith. This not only strengthened the Pope's political influence but also solidified the idea of a unified Christian identity against a perceived external threat. However, the later failures of the Crusades, including the disastrous Fourth Crusade which saw Christians sacking Constantinople, also exposed the limits of papal power and led to growing disillusionment among the faithful. Theologically, the Crusades fostered a militant interpretation of Christianity that contrasted with earlier teachings of peace and forgiveness. The concept of holy war, though not entirely new, became more deeply embedded in Christian thought. The idea that shedding blood in the name of God could be an act of piety and even a means of salvation was promoted through indulgences granted to crusaders. This shift had long-term repercussions, as it contributed to the justification of religious violence in later conflicts, including the Reconquista and the wars against heretical movements in Europe. At the same time, the Crusades facilitated an unprecedented exchange of knowledge and culture between the Christian West and the Islamic East. European exposure to advanced Islamic scholarship in fields such as medicine, astronomy, and philosophy led to a revival of learning in the West. The translation of classical Greek texts, preserved and expanded upon by Muslim scholars, reintroduced Aristotelian logic and other intellectual traditions to Europe, laying the groundwork for the scholastic movement and the eventual Renaissance. This cultural cross-pollination challenged and enriched Christian thought, forcing theologians to engage with new ideas and perspectives. The Crusades also had a profound effect on the structure and wealth of the Church. The establishment of military orders, such as the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, blurred the lines between religious and martial vocations. These orders amassed significant land, wealth, and political influence, becoming powerful institutions in their own right. However, their eventual suppression, particularly the Templars' dramatic downfall in the early 14th century, highlighted the dangers of combining spiritual and temporal power and contributed to growing calls for reform within the Church. Moreover, the Crusades deepened the schism between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. The sack of Constantinople by Crusaders in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade created lasting resentment among Byzantine Christians, making any genuine reconciliation between the two branches of Christianity increasingly unlikely. This division weakened Christendom as a whole and left the Byzantine Empire vulnerable to later Ottoman conquest. On a societal level, the Crusades contributed to the rise of anti-Semitic violence in Europe. As Crusaders marched toward the Holy Land, many turned their fury against Jewish communities, accusing them of deicide and economic exploitation. These pogroms, often justified by religious fervor, set a dangerous precedent for the persecution of Jews in medieval and early modern Europe. In the long term, the failures and excesses of the Crusades contributed to the erosion of the Church's moral authority, paving the way for the Protestant Reformation. Critics like Martin Luther pointed to the corruption and militarization of the Church as evidence of its deviation from true Christian teachings. The Reformation, in turn, shattered the religious unity of Western Europe and gave rise to diverse Christian traditions that rejected papal supremacy. Despite their mixed legacy, the Crusades undeniably shaped the evolution of Christianity in both positive and negative ways. They reinforced the power of the papacy, altered Christian theology, and stimulated intellectual growth through cross-cultural encounters. Yet they also sowed division, justified violence in the name of faith, and exposed the vulnerabilities of an increasingly politicized Church. The echoes of the Crusades can still be felt in contemporary discussions about religious conflict, the relationship between faith and power, and the enduring tensions between different Christian traditions. The Crusades and the rise of military orders in Christianity. The Crusades, a series of religious wars initiated by the Latin Church in the medieval period, played a pivotal role in shaping the military, political, and spiritual landscape of Christianity. Among their most enduring legacies was the emergence of military orders, unique institutions that combined monastic discipline with martial prowess. These orders, such as the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights, became powerful entities that not only participated in the Crusades but also influenced European society for centuries. To understand how the Crusades contributed to their rise, one must examine the historical context, the evolving needs of the Christian states in the Levant, and the Church's sanctioning of armed religious brotherhoods. The origins of the military orders can be traced back to the late 11th century, when the First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, succeeded in capturing Jerusalem and establishing the Crusader states. These fragile territories, surrounded by hostile Muslim neighbors, required constant defense. However, the feudal armies of Europe were insufficient for long-term protection, as many crusaders returned home after fulfilling their vows. This created a pressing need for a permanent military force dedicated to safeguarding pilgrims and maintaining Christian control over the Holy Land. Initially, groups of knights and monks independently took up the task of protecting travelers along the dangerous routes to Jerusalem. Among the earliest of these groups were the Knights Templar, founded around 1119 by Hugh de Payens and a small band of companions. They pledged to defend pilgrims and adopted a monastic rule, living in poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their dual role as warriors and monks was revolutionary, and their efforts quickly gained the attention of the Church. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, the Templars received official recognition from Pope Honorius II, endorsing their hybrid identity as a religious military order. The success of the Templars inspired the establishment of other military orders. The Knights Hospitaller, originally a charitable organization founded in the 11th century to care for sick pilgrims, gradually took on a military role as the need for armed defenders grew. By the mid-12th century, they had transformed into a formidable military order while retaining their hospitaller functions. Similarly, the Teutonic Knights emerged during the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, initially serving as a field hospital before evolving into a military brotherhood focused on defending Christian interests in the Holy Land and later in the Baltic region. The Church's support was crucial in legitimizing these orders. Popes granted them special privileges, exempting them from local ecclesiastical authority and placing them directly under papal jurisdiction. They were also allowed to collect tithes, own land, and build castles, making them economically and militarily self-sufficient. This autonomy enabled them to operate independently of secular rulers. Though they often collaborated with crusader leaders, the military order's effectiveness in battle further solidified their importance. They were highly disciplined, well-trained, and better organized than feudal levies, making them indispensable in key conflicts such as the Battle of Montbéliard, 1177, where the Templars played a decisive role in defeating Saladin's forces. Their network of fortresses, including Croix de Chevaliers and Margat, served as strategic strongholds that prolonged Crusader rule in the Levant. However, the decline of the Crusader states after the fall of Jerusalem in 1187 and the eventual loss of Acre in 1291 forced the military orders to adapt. While the Templars were disbanded in the early 14th century due to political persecution, the Hospitallers relocated to Rhodes and later Malta, continuing their fight against Islamic powers in the Mediterranean. The Teutonic Knights shifted their focus to the Baltic, engaging in the Northern Crusades and establishing a monastic state in Prussia. In conclusion, the Crusades created the conditions necessary for the rise of military orders by generating a sustained demand for holy warriors in the East. These orders, blending religious devotion with military duty, became a defining feature of medieval Christianity. Their legacy endured long after the Crusades, influencing the development of chivalric culture, European expansionism, and even modern charitable and military organizations.